It was a quiet evening when 22-year-old Emily received a phone call that would alter her life forever. She was in her cramped studio apartment, scrolling through job listings with mounting frustration, when a well-dressed man appeared at her door. What he proposed seemed like a bizarre dream, or perhaps a nightmare. By the end of the month, Emily would be married to a 75-year-old man, a reclusive millionaire named Mr. Harrington. She thought she understood his intentions, but she had no idea what she was walking into. Emily had always been a survivor. Growing up in a small town with limited opportunities, she had learned to scrape by with part-time jobs and odd gigs. But after her mother's illness drained the little savings she had, Emily was desperate. That desperation led her to respond to a cryptic job advertisement promising financial security in exchange for companionship. When the mysterious man at her door introduced himself as Charles, Mr. Harrington's assistant, he offered her something far more peculiar than a job: an arranged marriage with an aging widower who needed a partner to fulfill the terms of his will. At first, Emily laughed it off. "Why me?" she asked. Charles's response was chillingly matter-of-fact. "Mr. Harrington has taken a liking to your profile. He believes you possess the qualities he seeks." The offer was tempting, too tempting. A year of marriage, and she'd be free to walk away with a small fortune, enough to pay off her debts and start fresh. It sounded like an unusual but harmless arrangement. Against her better judgment, Emily agreed to meet Mr. Harrington. The first meeting took place in Harrington Manor, a sprawling estate that loomed on the outskirts of the city. The house was a labyrinth of dark wood paneling, creaking floors, and ornate chandeliers that cast eerie shadows. Mr. Harrington sat in an oversized armchair, frail but with piercing eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. His voice, though soft, carried an undeniable authority. "Emily," he said with a thin smile, "you'll find that I'm not as fragile as I appear." The arrangement was laid out in painstaking detail. They would marry quietly, and she would move into the manor. Her duties? Simply to keep him company and manage the household. Emily felt a strange unease settle over her, but Charles reassured her that everything was above board. 2 weeks later, they were married in a small ceremony attended only by Mr. Harrington's lawyer, Charles, and a few distant relatives. Emily tried to ignore the whispers and disapproving glances from the guests. This was temporary, she reminded herself. She just needed to survive the year. On her first night in Harrington Manor, Emily began to sense that something was off. The house had a palpable presence, as if it were alive and watching her every move. In her new bedroom, an opulent suite decorated with antique furniture, she found a journal tucked inside a drawer. The name embossed on the cover made her heart skip. Margaret Harrington, Mr. Harrington's late wife. Curiosity got the better of her, and she began reading. Margaret's entries started off innocently enough, descriptions of her life in the manor, her love for her husband. But as Emily flipped through the pages, the tone grew darker. Margaret wrote about strange noises in the house at night, shadows that didn't belong to anyone, and a growing fear that something in the manor wanted her gone. That night, Emily struggled to sleep. The heavy silence of the house was interrupted by faint footsteps outside her door. Gathering her courage, she opened the door to find an empty hallway. But just as she turned to go back inside, she thought she saw a figure at the end of the corridor, a woman in a white gown, standing deathly still. Emily blinked, and the figure was gone. As days turned into weeks, Emily's relationship with Mr. Harrington grew increasingly tense. He was cordial but distant, his moods unpredictable. Sometimes he would sit with her in the library, recounting stories of his younger days. Other times he would retreat to his private study, locking the door behind him for hours on end. Emily wasn't allowed inside, a rule he enforced with uncharacteristic sternness. One evening, during dinner, Emily finally mustered the courage to ask about Margaret. Mr. Harrington's face darkened, and his fork clattered onto the plate. "Some things are better left buried," he said, his tone icy. But the mysteries of the manor refused to stay buried. Emily began hearing whispers in the halls, faint and unintelligible but unmistakably real. Objects seemed to move on their own. A vase toppled over when she walked by, A door that she swore she had closed creaked open behind her. And then there were the dreams. Every night, she dreamed of the woman in the white gown, her face obscured, her outstretched hand beckoning Emily deeper into the house. One fateful night, driven by an unshakable sense of dread, Emily decided to explore the forbidden study. She waited until Mr. Harrington retired to bed, then picked the lock using skills she'd picked up from her less savory jobs. The room was cold and filled with the smell of old paper. Shelves lined the walls, packed with leather-bound books and dusty trinkets. In the center of the room was a desk, and on it, a photograph caught her eye. It was a portrait of Mr. Harrington and Margaret, but it wasn't the smiling couple that unnerved her. It was the woman in the background. Dressed in white, her face obscured by shadows, she looked just like the figure from Emily's dreams. Beneath the photograph was a letter, written in a hurried scrawl. The words made Emily's blood run cold. Margaret's presence lingers. She won't let me go. As she stood there, frozen with fear, a low creak echoed behind her. Emily turned slowly to see the door closing on its own. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispers began again, this time louder and more menacing. Emily stumbled out of the study, her heart pounding, her mind racing with questions. Emily's life in Harrington Manor had become a waking nightmare. The whispers, the shadows, the cryptic messages, they all pointed to a truth she wasn't ready to face. Margaret Harrington wasn't just a memory in the walls of the manor. She was still there, watching, waiting. And Emily was beginning to realize that her unlikely marriage to Mr. Harrington might cost her far more than she had ever imagined. Emily's fear of the manor had grown into a constant, gnawing dread. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the candlelight, every gust of wind against the tall, Gothic windows sent chills down her spine. Her discovery of Margaret's letter and the photograph in Mr. Harrington's study had confirmed her worst fears. The presence in the house was not just a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was growing stronger. But the more Emily tried to uncover the secrets of Harrington Manor, the more the house seemed to resist her efforts. What was it that the late Margaret Harrington wanted her to know? And what dark truth was her husband desperately trying to hide? The following days brought a cascade of unsettling events. Emily began waking up to find her belongings rearranged. A favorite bracelet she had left on the nightstand would be on the dresser in the morning. A chair would be moved slightly out of place. At first, she thought it was Mr. Harrington or perhaps the housekeeper, but the longer it went on, the more she realized that no one in the house had touched her things. One night, as she lay in bed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Pressing her ear against the cold, ornate paneling, she could make out fragments of words. Leave, must leave, danger. Panicked, she bolted upright and turned on the bedside lamp, only to find a single white rose lying on her pillow. She hadn't placed it there. She hadn't even seen roses anywhere in the house. Her breathing quickened as her eyes darted around the room, but she was alone, or so it seemed. The next morning, Emily confronted Charles. She cornered him in the kitchen, her voice trembling but firm. "What is going on in this house?" she demanded. "I know something isn't right. You must know too." Charles hesitated, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Finally, he sighed and lowered his voice. "I've served Mr. Harrington for over 20 years, he said, "and I've seen things here that defy explanation. Margaret, she never left. At least not entirely." Emily felt a cold wave wash over her. "What do you mean?" Charles leaned in closer. Margaret was deeply unhappy in this house. She tried to leave him once, but she never made it far. And after her death, strange things began happening. The whispers, the movements. "I believe her spirit is trapped here, and it's grown restless since you arrived. Why didn't you tell me this before?" Emily asked, anger creeping into her voice. "I couldn't," Charles admitted. "Mr. Harrington forbade it. He's terrified of her, and I think you remind her of what she lost." Determined to get answers, Emily decided to search the manor for anything that could shed light on Margaret's death. Late one evening, while Mr. Harrington was asleep, she ventured into the cellar, a place Charles had warned her to avoid. The air was damp and heavy, the smell of mildew thick. The cellar was more expansive than she had imagined, lined with shelves of dusty wine bottles and cobweb-covered furniture. As she moved deeper, her flashlight beam illuminated a heavy wooden trunk tucked into a shadowy corner. The brass lock was rusted, but with some effort, she pried it open. Inside, she found a collection of personal items: a delicate pearl necklace, a silk scarf, and a bundle of letters tied with a crimson ribbon. The letters were addressed to Margaret, but they weren't from Mr. Harrington. They were love letters, passionate and filled with longing, signed by someone named Daniel. Emily's hands trembled as she read them. Margaret had been in love with someone else, a forbidden romance that she had tried to keep secret. But the last letter was the most chilling. It was unfinished, the ink smudged as though it had been hastily written. "Margaret, I can't stand by and watch him hurt you any longer. Meet me by the old oak at midnight, and we'll leave this place for good. Together." The letter was dated the night before Margaret's death. Armed with this new information, Emily confronted Mr. Harrington in the dining room the following evening. He was seated at the head of the long, imposing table, sipping a glass of brandy. "I found Margaret's letters," she said, placing them on the table before him. "She was trying to leave you. She was in love with someone else." Mr. Harrington's hand trembled slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said coldly. "Don't I?" Emily challenged. "She was planning to run away, and you found out. What did you do to her, Mr. Harrington?" His gaze darkened. For a moment, she thought he might lash out, but instead, he let out a bitter laugh. "You think you've uncovered some grand mystery, don't you?" he said. "But you've only scratched the surface. Margaret wasn't the victim you imagine her to be. She was dangerous." Emily's confusion deepened. "Dangerous? How?" "She dabbled in things she shouldn't have," he said cryptically. "She thought she could control the house, bend it to her will. But she was wrong. The house doesn't obey anyone. It has a will of its own." That night, Emily's dreams took on a horrifying clarity. She saw Margaret in her white gown, standing by the old oak tree mentioned in the letter. Margaret's face was pale and sorrowful, but her eyes burned with a quiet rage. Emily heard her voice, soft but commanding. "Find the truth. Set me free." When she awoke, she knew what she had to do. The manor wasn't just haunted, it was a prison. Margaret's spirit was trapped, and whatever had happened on that fateful night by the old oak was the key to freeing her. But as Emily began piecing together the truth, the house seemed to fight back. Doors slammed shut as she approached. The whispers grew deafening, and shadows seemed to stalk her every move. And then there was Mr. Harrington, who began acting more erratic, his polite facade crumbling to reveal a man consumed by fear and guilt. Emily now stood on the precipice of a terrifying revelation. The manor held secrets darker than she could have imagined, and the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous her situation became. Margaret wasn't just a restless spirit, she was a warning. And if Emily didn't heed it, she might not live to uncover the full story. Emily's nights in Harrington Manor had become an endless battle with fear. The whispers, the moving shadows, and Margaret's spirit weren't just remnants of a tragic past. They were pieces of a puzzle that seemed to demand her attention. As Emily dug deeper into the mystery of Margaret's death, the house began to reveal its sinister intentions. Her confrontation with Mr. Harrington had left her with more questions than answers, and she knew the truth lay somewhere beyond the cryptic warnings and the house's eerie resistance. But Emily's determination came at a cost. The house had begun to close in around her, and even as she inched closer to uncovering the truth, she realized she might not survive the answers. Margaret's final letter had mentioned the old oak, a gnarled tree standing at the edge of the estate. Emily decided she had to see it for herself. Under the cover of night, she slipped out of the manor, flashlight in hand, and made her way to the sprawling gardens. The oak loomed in the moonlight, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. Beneath it, the ground seemed disturbed, as though someone had dug there before. Emily dropped to her knees and began to scrape away the earth with her hands. The soil was damp and cold, and with every handful, she felt a growing sense of dread. After what felt like hours, her fingers struck something hard, a box. Pulling it free, she opened it to find a collection of personal items: a locket, a diary, and a small vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. The locket contained a photograph of Margaret and a man she didn't recognize, presumably Daniel, her lover. But it was the diary that held the most chilling revelations. Margaret had written about the house in painstaking detail, describing its living nature and its ability to manipulate those within it. She spoke of her growing fear of Mr. Harrington, whom she accused of trapping her within the manor through some dark ritual. And then there was an entry dated the night of her death. "Tonight, I'll meet Daniel under the oak. If we succeed, I'll be free. If not, I fear I'll never leave this place." Emily's blood ran cold. Margaret had been trying to escape not just her husband, but the house itself. And she had failed. As Emily hurried back to the manor, clutching the diary, the air seemed to grow heavier around her. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and menacing. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The whispers began almost immediately, louder and more urgent than ever before. Leave, or join her." Emily bolted up the stairs, the diary clutched tightly in her hand. She needed to confront Mr. Harrington, to demand the truth about what he had done to Margaret. But as she reached the second floor, the temperature dropped sharply and the lights flickered. The hallway ahead of her seemed to stretch endlessly, and the walls pulsed as though they were alive. And then she saw her. Margaret stood at the far end of the hall, her white gown billowing as though caught in a phantom wind. Her face was obscured, but her outstretched hand beckoned Emily forward. Against her better judgment, Emily took a step toward her. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet gave way, and she plummeted into darkness. When Emily awoke, she found herself in a dimly lit chamber beneath the manor. The walls were lined with strange symbols, painted in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room stood an altar, and atop it was a single, flickering candle. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Mr. Harrington was there, his frail frame hunched over the altar. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "You weren't supposed to find this place," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. Emily stood, her legs trembling. "What is this? What did you do to Margaret?" Mr. Harrington sighed, his gaze distant. Margaret was never content. She wanted more: freedom, love, a life beyond these walls. But the house wouldn't allow it. You see, Harrington Manor isn't just a home. It's a vessel, a keeper of souls. My family has served it for generations, feeding it what it needs to thrive. Emily's stomach churned. "You're saying you sacrificed her?" "I had no choice," he said, his voice breaking. "She tried to leave, and the house wouldn't allow it. I made a pact to spare her suffering. But now, her spirit is restless, and you've awakened her." Emily felt a surge of anger. "She wasn't yours to sacrifice, and I won't let you do this to anyone else." The house seemed to come alive around them, the walls trembling and the whispers turning into a deafening roar. Margaret's ghost appeared, her figure glowing with an otherworldly light. This time, her face was visible, and it was etched with both sorrow and fury. "You lied to me," Margaret's voice echoed, directed at Mr. Harrington. "You said you'd protect me, but you trapped me here." Mr. Harrington fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I did it for us, for the house." Margaret's gaze shifted to Emily. "You can free me," she said softly. "Destroy the house. And the cycle." Emily looked at the symbols on the walls and realized they were the key. Grabbing a nearby candelabra, she set the altar ablaze. The fire quickly spread, consuming the room in a fiery glow. As the flames grew, the house began to shake violently. The whispers turned into screams, and Emily felt the floor collapse beneath her once again. She was falling, surrounded by darkness, until she suddenly woke up outside the manor. Harrington Manor was gone. Reduced to ashes, it left behind nothing but an empty, charred field. Emily stood there, bruised but alive, clutching Margaret's locket in her hand. The ghostly presence was gone, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt still. But as she turned to leave, she thought she heard a faint whisper on the wind. "Thank you." Emily had freed Margaret and ended the house's dark reign, but she knew the experience would haunt her forever. The destruction of Harrington Manor had left Emily shaken but determined to reclaim her life. The house, with its eerie whispers and oppressive darkness, was finally gone, reduced to ashes by her desperate act of defiance. Yet, as she walked away from the charred ruins, a nagging feeling lingered. The events she had witnessed, the spirit of Margaret, the haunting whispers, the dark pact, were not just remnants of the past. They were part of something much larger, something far from over. Emily was free from the manor, but the curse tied to its legacy was still very much alive. And now, it was coming for her. Emily tried to resume her life after leaving Harrington Manor. She moved into a modest apartment in the city and picked up part-time work, hoping to forget the horrors she had endured. For a while, it seemed to work. She found comfort in the mundane routines of everyday life: grocery shopping, casual walks in the park, and the warmth of sunlight streaming through her windows. But the peace was short-lived. At night, she began to experience vivid nightmares. She dreamt of the house, its dark corridors stretching endlessly, and Margaret standing at the edge of the flames, her face twisted with sorrow. In every dream, Margaret's voice echoed the same words: "You freed me, but the curse remains." Emily woke from these dreams drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. The first real sign of the curse came one evening as Emily prepared dinner. She was chopping vegetables when the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual. Power outages were common in her older building, but then she noticed the reflection in the kitchen window. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing behind her. She spun around, knife in hand, but the kitchen was empty. Her heart raced as she scanned the room, her mind racing back to the whispers of Harrington Manor. "It's just your imagination," she told herself, trying to shake off the unease. But the occurrences became more frequent. Objects in her apartment began to move on their own. A glass slid across the table. Her keys appeared in a different spot than she had left them, and her bedroom door creaked open in the middle of the night. And then the whispers returned. They were faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakably real. "Leave, leave!" Desperate for answers, Emily reached out to Charles, Mr. Harrington's former assistant. She hadn't spoken to him since the fire, but she knew he held knowledge about the manor and its dark history. Charles was reluctant to meet, but eventually he agreed. They met at a small cafe, far from prying ears. He looked tired, his face lined with worry. "I thought it was over," Emily said, her voice trembling. "The house is gone. Margaret is free. So why is this still happening to me?" Charles sighed heavily, taking a sip of his coffee. "The house may be gone, but its curse wasn't tied to the structure alone. Harrington Manor was built on cursed land, a legacy that goes back generations. The family's wealth and power came at a cost, a pact made long before Mr. Harrington's time." Emily's blood ran cold. "What kind of pact?" Charles hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if he feared being overheard. "The Harringtons bargained with something ancient. It promised them prosperity in exchange for loyalty. But over the years, the price changed. It demanded more. Souls, blood, suffering. Margaret was just one of many victims. But why me?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not part of their family." "That's the thing," Charles said, leaning closer. "The curse doesn't just bind to the Harringtons. It spreads to anyone who becomes entangled in its web. And you're now part of that web." Emily's mind reeled as she processed Charles's words. The curse wasn't confined to the manor or the Harrington family. It was a living force, feeding on those it touched. And now, it had marked her. Determined to break the curse once and for all, Emily delved into research. She spent hours at libraries and scoured the internet for information about the Harrington family and the land on which the manor had stood. What she uncovered sent chills down her spine. The land had once been a sacred site for an ancient, long-forgotten civilization. It was said to be a place of power, a gateway between worlds. When the Harrington family acquired it, they desecrated the site to build their empire, unknowingly awakening something malevolent. The more Emily learned, the clearer it became. The curse was tied to the land itself, and if she wanted to rid herself of it, she would have to confront it at its source. Armed with her newfound knowledge, Emily returned to the ruins of Harrington Manor. The site was eerily quiet, the charred remains of the house hidden beneath overgrown grass and weeds. The air was heavy, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Emily carried with her Margaret's locket and the vial she had found beneath the old oak. She believed they were keys to unlocking the curse. Following the instructions she had pieced together from her research, she made her way to the center of the property, where the foundations of the house had once stood. As night fell, she began the ritual. She lit candles in a circle around her and recited the incantations she had memorized, her voice trembling. The air grew colder with every word, and the ground beneath her began to tremble. Suddenly, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. Shadows emerged from the darkness, swirling around her like a tempest. Among them, she saw faces, anguished, tormented faces, reaching out to her. Margaret's face appeared, her expression filled with both sorrow and hope. "You're so close," Margaret's voice echoed. "You can end it." As the ritual reached its climax, Emily felt the weight of the curse bearing down on her. The shadows closed in, and the whispers threatened to overwhelm her. But she refused to give in. With a final, desperate cry, she shattered the vial, letting its contents spill onto the ground. The effect was immediate. The shadows recoiled, the whispers ceased, and the air grew still. The land seemed to sigh, as though releasing centuries of pent-up anguish. Emily collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. She had done it. She had severed the curse's hold on the land and herself. But as she stood to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that her battle with the darkness wasn't entirely over. Emily had survived the impossible. She had confronted the dark forces tied to Harrington Manor, severed the ancient curse, and walked away alive. But as she left the ruins behind, an unsettling feeling lingered, a quiet whisper at the edge of her mind, as if the darkness hadn't fully let her go. The land may have been freed, but curses like this rarely vanish without leaving scars. Emily was about to discover that breaking a curse is one thing. Escaping its consequences is another. In the days following the ritual, Emily felt lighter, almost euphoric. The whispers had stopped, the shadows were gone, and for the first time in months, she could sleep peacefully. Her life seemed to be returning to normal. She even allowed herself to hope that the horrors of Harrington Manor were finally behind her. But then the dreams returned. They weren't like the nightmares she'd had before. These dreams were vivid, almost lucid, and filled with unsettling imagery. She saw the faces of the souls she had freed, Margaret, Daniel, and others she didn't recognize. They didn't speak, but their expressions were haunting. Some looked grateful, others angry, and a few empty. In one dream, Margaret appeared to her, standing in a vast, desolate field. "You've done well," she said, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. But the curse was never just about the land. It was about what it touched, and it touched you. Emily woke with a start, Margaret's words echoing in her ears. The curse wasn't entirely gone. A part of it had latched onto her, and she would have to face it if she wanted to be free. One afternoon, there was a knock at Emily's door. She hesitated before answering, half expecting to see Charles. Instead, it was a woman she didn't recognize, tall, with sharp features and piercing green eyes. "Emily," the woman said, her tone even but firm. "My name is Eleanor. I'm a historian of sorts. I've been following your story." Emily frowned. "How do you know about me?" "The curse," Eleanor said simply. "It's older than the Harrington family, older than the house. You've encountered something very few people have, and even fewer survive." Emily hesitated, her hand still on the doorknob. "What do you want?" "To help you," Eleanor said. "You've broken the main tether of the curse, but its remnants cling to you. And if you don't confront them, they'll consume you." Against her better judgment, Emily let her in. Eleanor explained that the curse wasn't just tied to the land or the Harrington family. It was an ancient entity, a parasitic force that thrived on human suffering and fear. By breaking the ritual at the ruins, Emily had disrupted its hold on the land, but the curse had adapted, binding itself to her as its new vessel. "You've become its anchor," Eleanor said, her voice grave. "And as long as it has a hold on you, it will try to rebuild itself." Emily's stomach churned. "How do I stop it?" Eleanor pulled out an old, leather-bound book filled with strange symbols and cryptic writings. "There's one final ritual, but it's dangerous. It will force the entity to reveal itself. And if you're strong enough, you can sever its connection to you. But if you fail," she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "I've come this far. I'll finish it." The ritual required a secluded place, so Eleanor took Emily to an abandoned chapel deep in the woods. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the crumbling stone walls. Inside, Eleanor arranged a circle of protective symbols on the floor and placed candles at its edges. As Emily stepped into the circle, Eleanor handed her a ceremonial dagger. "This isn't for the entity," she explained. "It's for you. If it tries to take control, you have to be willing to fight it." Emily nodded, clutching the dagger tightly. As Eleanor began chanting in a language Emily didn't recognize, the air in the chapel grew heavy, oppressive. The shadows on the walls began to twist and move, taking on shapes that seemed almost human. Suddenly, a bone-chilling voice echoed through the chapel. "You think you can banish me, little girl?" The voice was everywhere and nowhere, deep and resonant, like the growl of a beast. The entity began to take form in the center of the circle, a mass of shifting darkness with glowing red eyes. Emily felt its presence pressing against her mind, probing her thoughts, searching for weaknesses. "You freed them," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "But you will never be free." The entity lunged at Emily, but it was stopped by the protective circle. It writhed and screamed, its form shifting between human faces, Margaret, Mr. Harrington, even Emily herself. It whispered her fears, her doubts, her pain, trying to break her resolve. "You're nothing," it said. "A broken girl with no future. You think you've won, but you'll always be mine." Emily gritted her teeth, her grip on the dagger tightening. "You don't control me," she said, her voice steady. "Not anymore." The entity howled, its form growing larger, more menacing. But Emily stepped forward, raising the dagger. She remembered Margaret's face, the faces of all the souls she had seen in her dreams. They had been trapped, just as she was now, but they had found peace. And so would she. With a final, defiant cry, Emily plunged the dagger into the center of the circle. The symbols on the floor flared to life, and the entity let out a deafening scream as it began to dissolve. The shadows retreated, the air cleared, and then there was silence. Emily collapsed to her knees, exhausted but victorious. Eleanor helped her to her feet, a rare smile on her face. "It's over," she said. "You did it." As they stepped out of the chapel into the cool night air, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer followed her, and for the first time in months, she felt truly free. But as they walked away, Emily glanced back at the chapel. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway. Margaret, her face serene, her hand raised in a silent goodbye. Emily smiled, her heart finally at peace. The curse was broken, and she had reclaimed her life. But she knew she would never forget the horrors she had faced, or the strength she had found within herself to overcome them.